singing for $20 tips just to keep the lights on for her infant son. Clariel was entirely unaware that she had brought the room to a dead halt. As the clinking glasses silenced, the city's most feared crime boss, nursing a scotch in the back booth, realized he had just found his new obsession. The winters in Chicago had a way of seeping into your bones, but for 24-year-old Clariel Hayes, the cold was the least of her worries. Her reality was measured in ounces of baby formula and the terrifying, towering stack of final notice medical bills sitting on her cramped kitchen counter. Her 6-month-old son, Leo, had been born with a severe respiratory defect. The surgeries had kept him alive. The debt was slowly burying her. Clariel's ex-boyfriend, a small-time hustler named Jimmy O'Rourke, had vanished the day the first hospital bill arrived, taking her meager savings with him, left with nothing but a desperate instinct to protect her child. Clariel took the only job she could find that accommodated her erratic schedule as a single mother, the late-night entertainment at the Brass Key, a crumbling dive bar on the south side. It was a Tuesday night, exactly 11:15 p.m. The bar smelled of stale beer, cheap bleach, and decades of bad decisions. Clariel stood on a tiny, splintering wooden stage, clutching a microphone wrapped in peeling electrical tape. She wore a faded velvet dress from a thrift store, the left shoulder bearing a faint, scrubbed-out stain from where Leo had spit up hours earlier. She wasn't singing for fame. She was singing for survival. As the band, a tired pianist and an upright bassist, plucked the opening notes of a slow, mournful jazz standard, Clariel closed her eyes. When she sang, the exhaustion melted away. Her voice was an anomaly in the grime of the Brass Key. It was rich, haunting, and soaked in a raw, bleeding sorrow that forced even the drunkest patrons to quiet down. In the darkest corner of the room, hidden by a veil of cigar smoke, sat Silas Moretti. To the outside world, Silas was the CEO of Moretti Logistics. To the underground, he was the undisputed king of the Chicago syndicate, a man whose whispered name commanded a terrifying respect. At 32, Silas had built an empire on calculated violence and emotional detachment. He was in the Brass Key for one reason: the owner, Sal, owed him $300,000, and Silas had come personally to collect the deed to the building in exchange for Sal keeping his kneecaps. Silas was flanked by two massive enforcers, his face an unreadable mask of cold marble. He was mid-sentence, about to order his men to drag a weeping Sal into the alley, when Clariel hit a high, aching note that seemed to shatter the heavy air in the room. Silas froze. He slowly turned his head toward the stage. Through the hazy, nicotine-stained light, he saw her. She wasn't wearing the flashy sequins or heavy makeup of the usual nightclub performers. She looked exhausted, brittle, yet impossibly defiant. As Clariel sang about loss and desperation, she wasn't just performing, she was bleeding out on stage. "Boss," one of the enforcers muttered, confused by the sudden halt. Silas didn't answer. He raised a single finger, silencing the man instantly. For the next 4 minutes, the brutal Mafia boss didn't blink. He watched the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the microphone stand. He heard the subtle break in her voice, a crack born not of poor technique, but of genuine, suffocating fear. When the song ended, the applause was scattered and drunk. Clariel offered a tight, practiced smile, collected the few crumpled bills thrown into the tip jar at the edge of the stage, and practically ran toward the back hallway. Silas took a slow sip of his scotch. He looked across the table at Sal, who was sweating profusely, waiting for the death blow. "The girl," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that offered no room for argument. "Who is she?" "Clariel," Sal stammered, wiping his forehead. "Just a local. Sings a few nights a week. Boss. About the money. I swear to God, I just need another. I don't want the building. Sal." Silas interrupted, leaning forward. The ice clinked softly in his glass. "I want the bar. You're going to sell it to me tonight, and you're going to double her salary. In fact, triple it." Sal stared at him, bewildered. You want to buy the brass key because of the singer?" Silas stood up, buttoning his tailored bespoke suit, his dark eyes devoid of any warmth. "I don't explain myself to dead men. Sal, consider your debt cleared. From now on, she works for me." As Silas walked out into the freezing Chicago night, he pulled out his phone. "Find out everything there is to know about Clariel Hayes," he ordered the voice on the other end. "Every debt, every enemy, every breath she takes." The next evening, Clariel arrived at the Brass Key, carrying a battered diaper bag and a sleeping Leo strapped to her chest in a worn baby carrier. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, who usually watched Leo for $20 a night, had fallen ill. Clariel had no choice. But when she walked through the doors, she stopped dead in her tracks. The Brass Key was unrecognizable. The sticky floors had been polished, the shattered neon signs replaced with dim, elegant ambient lighting, and the usual crowd of roughneck regulars had been replaced by men in sharply tailored suits and women in evening gowns. Security guards men who looked like they were built out of granite stood at every entrance. "What is going on?" Clariel whispered to herself, instinctively wrapping her arms protectively around Leo. "Clariel." She spun around to see Sal, though he didn't look like himself. He was wearing a brand new suit, but he looked pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Sal, what happened to the place? And where are my usual tables?" "Management changed," Sal said quickly, refusing to meet her eyes. "Overnight, you're not singing in the main room anymore. You've been requested in the VIP lounge upstairs. Exclusive." "Requested by who, Sal? I have my baby with me. I can't just—" "You're making $5,000 a week now. Clariel." Sal blurted out. Clariel felt the breath leave her lungs. $5,000. That was a month of Leo's oxygen tank rentals. That was rent. That was groceries. It was an impossible sum. "Who bought the bar?" "Sal," she asked, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. "I did." The voice came from the top of the velvet-lined staircase. Clariel looked up. Silas Moretti stood there, a towering silhouette against the dim light. He descended the stairs with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. As he stepped into the light, Clariel felt a cold shiver run down her spine. He was breathtakingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features and dark eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. But there was a lethal stillness to him that screamed danger. "I am Silas," he said, stopping a few feet from her. He didn't offer his hand. His gaze drifted from her face down to the bundle strapped to her chest. Leo stirred, letting out a soft, sleepy coo. Silas's eyes narrowed slightly. "You brought a child to a bar." Clariel immediately went on the defensive, her maternal instincts flaring. "My sitter cancelled. He stays in the back office. He doesn't make a sound. If that's a problem, you can keep your $5,000. Mr. Silas. And I'll find work somewhere else." Silence hung heavily in the air. The security guards near the door tensed. No one spoke to Silas Moretti that way. No one breathed oxygen for very long after showing him disrespect. But Silas just stared at her, an unreadable expression passing over his face. He took a slow step closer. He reached out a large, heavily ringed hand. Clariel flinched, preparing for a blow, but his hand bypassed her entirely. "He looks like you," Silas murmured. Then, his eyes snapped back to hers, the coldness returning. "The back office is a health hazard. I've had the upstairs suite renovated. It has a crib, a changing station, and soundproofing. You will leave him there with my personal security detail while you sing. You will sing only for me and the guests I approve of. Do we have an agreement?" Miss Hayes. Clariel was paralyzed. "Why are you doing this?" "Because your voice is an asset," he replied smoothly. "And I protect my assets." For the next 3 weeks, Clariel lived in a bizarre, luxurious purgatory. The money was real. Every Friday, a crisp envelope containing $5,000 was handed to her. She caught up on rent. She bought Leo his specialized medication without having to beg the pharmacist for an extension. But the VIP lounge was a terrifying world. She sang jazz and blues for men who carried guns in shoulder holsters and spoke in hushed, violent whispers. Silas was always there, sitting in the center booth, watching her with those dark, predatory eyes. They rarely spoke, but she felt his gaze like a physical weight on her skin. Then came the night the illusion shattered. Clariel was finishing her set, stepping off the stage to head to the nursery suite, when she heard a commotion near the back entrance. Voices were raised, furniture crashed. She rushed toward the hallway, her heart pounding. 2 men, not Silas's men, but strangers wearing leather jackets with a red serpent emblem, were bleeding on the floor, restrained by Silas's security. Silas stood over them, holding a heavy iron fire poker. He looked entirely different. The polished CEO was gone. In his place was a monster of pure, unadulterated violence. "I told you," Silas hissed, his voice venomous. "She belongs to me now. The debt is void. O'Rourke owed the Lupatazzi family 50 grand. One of the bleeding men spat out. Jimmy's dead, floating in the river. The debt passes to his girl. We take her, or we take the baby." The man didn't get to finish. Silas swung the iron poker with sickening force, catching the man across the jaw. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the hallway. Clariel screamed, covering her mouth in horror. Silas froze, the bloody poker in his hand. He slowly turned to see Clariel standing there, trembling, tears streaming down her face. She finally understood. Jimmy, her deadbeat ex, hadn't just run away. He had gotten himself killed, and he had owed money to the Lupatazzi crime family, Silas's fiercest rivals in the Chicago underworld. They had come for her. They had come for Leo. Silas dropped the poker. It clattered loudly against the floorboards. He took a step toward her, holding up his hands in a rare gesture of surrender. "Clariel," he said, his voice suddenly stripped of its terrifying edge, revealing a desperate, frantic urgency. "Listen to me. They are never going to touch him. They are never going to touch you. Who are you?" she sobbed, backing away. "What kind of world have you pulled me into?" "The only world that can keep you alive," Silas replied, closing the distance between them and gripping her shoulders with surprising gentleness. "Jimmy signed your death warrant. I bought this bar to put a wall of guns between you and the men who want to collect. You aren't my employee, Clariel." He looked deeply into her panicked eyes, the ruthless Mafia boss entirely stripped bare. "You're my sanctuary." Clariel's world shifted overnight, from the grueling poverty of the South Side to the terrifying, gilded heights of the Gold Coast. Silas moved her and Leo out of her dilapidated apartment and into his sprawling penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and silent, heavily armed men. For the first few days, Clariel was a ghost. She paced the heated marble floors, terrified of the man who had claimed her as his sanctuary. Silas was a paradox. During the day, he was a phantom, barking brutal orders into encrypted phones, managing an illicit empire that spanned the Midwest. But in the evenings, the blood-stained king of Chicago would sit in the nursery, a room he had furnished overnight with the best Italian cribs and imported toys, and simply watch Leo sleep. One evening, Clariel found Silas holding Leo. The baby's breathing monitor had beeped, a false alarm, but it had sent Silas rushing into the room before Clariel could even get out of bed. Silas was gently rocking the boy, his massive hand supporting Leo's fragile back. "You don't have to do that," Clariel whispered, lingering in the doorway. Silas didn't turn around. "My father was a monster. Clariel, he taught me that attachment was a liability, a noose around a man's neck." He slowly laid Leo back into the crib, pulling the soft blanket over his chest. Finally, he turned to face her, his dark eyes vulnerable in the dim light. "I thought he was right, until I heard you sing, until I saw what you were willing to endure for him." Clariel crossed the room, the space between them suddenly crackling with an unspoken, terrifying electricity. "Silas, the Lupatazzi family, they aren't going to just let this go. $50,000 might be pocket change to you, but to them, it's about your pride. If Jimmy really is dead, they will keep coming." Silas reached out, his knuckles grazing her cheek. "I have Chicago locked down. Dominic Lupatazzi knows better than to start a war he cannot win. You are safe here." But the illusion of safety shattered 3 days later, outside the sterile walls of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Leo was due for his bi-monthly respiratory checkup with Dr. Harrison Gable, a prominent pediatric pulmonologist. Silas had insisted on sending an armored SUV and 4 of his best men, led by a stoic enforcer named Dante. The appointment went flawlessly. Leo's lungs were getting stronger. For the first time in months, Clariel felt a genuine, unburdened smile cross her face as she buckled her son into his car seat in the hospital's underground parking garage. "All clear. Miss Hayes," Dante said, scanning the concrete pillars. "Let's get you home." Suddenly, the screech of tires echoed through the concrete cavern. A black van slammed into the front of their SUV, pinning it against a pillar. Before Dante could draw his weapon, the side doors of the van flew open. Automatic gunfire tore through the air, deafening and bright. Dante yelled, shoving Clariel down behind the engine block of the SUV as glass shattered around them. "Get in the car! Lock the doors!" Dante roared, returning fire. Clariel scrambled over the shattered glass, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the door handle. She threw herself over Leo's car seat, shielding his small body with her own. The gunfire abruptly stopped. Heavy footsteps crunched on the broken glass. Well, look at you. Clariel, moving up in the world." The voice was like ice water down her spine. It was familiar. Too familiar. Clariel slowly raised her head, peering through the shattered window. Standing there, flanked by 3 heavily armed Lupatazzi soldiers, was Jimmy O'Rourke. He wasn't dead. He wasn't floating in the Chicago River. He looked slightly battered, sporting a nasty scar across his chin, but he was very much alive. Jimmy wore a smug, desperate smirk, holding a pistol aimed loosely at Dante, who was bleeding heavily from a wound in his shoulder, pinned behind a concrete pillar. "Jimmy, bro." Clariel breathed, the betrayal hitting her harder than physical violence. "They said you were dead." "Yeah, well, a guy's got to do what a guy's got to do to buy some time." Jimmy spat, his eyes darting nervously around the garage. "Dominic Lupatazzi wasn't happy I lost his money, but I made him a deal. I told him I knew the great Silas Moretti's new weakness." Jimmy laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "Who would have thought the Ice King of Chicago would lose his mind over my sloppy seconds?" "Don't you talk about her," Dante snarled, raising his weapon, but a Lupatazzi soldier immediately trained a shotgun on his head. "Lower it, Dante!" Clariel screamed, terrified for the man's life. She kicked open the car door and stepped out, keeping her body between Jimmy and her baby. "What do you want?" "Jimmy Silas paid your debt. It's over. It ain't about the debt anymore." "Sweetie," Jimmy sneered, stepping closer. "Dominic wants to humiliate Moretti. He wants to take the one thing Moretti actually cares about. And Dominic promised me a clean slate and a ticket to Rio if I deliver you and the kid to him." He reached out and grabbed Clariel by the hair. She cried out, struggling against him, but he yanked her hard against his chest, pressing the cold barrel of the gun to her temple. "Be a good girl, Clariel. Don't make me do something messy in front of the boy." Before Jimmy could drag her toward the van, the screech of a high-performance engine ripped through the garage. A sleek, midnight black sedan tore around the corner at terrifying speed, drifting violently before slamming head-on into the side of the Lupatazzi van. The Lupatazzi soldiers scrambled. The driver's side door of the sedan flew open. Silas stepped out. He didn't look like a CEO today. He wore a long, dark overcoat. A suppressed tactical pistol gripped loosely in his right hand. His face was a mask of absolute, biblical fury. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He walked toward Jimmy with the slow, inevitable momentum of an executioner. "Moretti!" Jimmy yelled, his voice cracking with sudden panic. He pressed the gun harder into Clariel's head. "Stay back. I'll blow her brains out. I swear to God." Silas didn't stop. 10 feet. 8 feet. "Jimmy," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet, echoing off the concrete. "If you pull that trigger, I am going to keep you alive for a very, very long time. You will beg me for death." Jimmy's hands were shaking. He was a street hustler, a coward who preyed on vulnerable women. He was entirely unequipped to look into the eyes of the apex predator of the criminal underworld. "Drop the gun," Silas commanded. I can't. Dominic will kill me," Jimmy stammered. "Dominic isn't here," Silas replied, raising his weapon with terrifying speed. "I am... Pfft." The suppressed shot was barely a whisper. Jimmy gasped, his eyes going wide. He dropped his gun, clutching his kneecap as blood instantly soaked his jeans. He collapsed to the floor, screaming in agony. Clariel stumbled forward, falling right into Silas's arms. He caught her, crushing her against his chest. His heart was hammering against her cheek, betraying the calm, icy exterior he projected to the world. He kissed the top of her head, his breathing jagged. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. his hands frantically checking her for blood. "No, I'm okay. Leo's okay," she sobbed, clinging to his coat. Silas looked over Clariel's shoulder at the writhing, whimpering form of Jimmy O'Rourke. He gestured to his backup detail, who had just flooded the garage. "Clean this up. Take him to the warehouse. Call Dominic Lupatazzi. Tell him the truce is broken. Tell him I want his head." The city of Chicago held its collective breath. Word of the botched hit in the Northwestern Memorial parking garage spread through the city's concrete veins like a gasoline fire. The streets of the Gold Coast grew eerily quiet as the Moretti and Lupatazzi factions prepared for a devastating bloodbath. Silas had transformed his sprawling penthouse into an impenetrable fortress. Tactical teams monitored the perimeter around the clock, and armored SUVs idled beneath the building. He had become a man possessed, coordinating a massive, ruthless offensive strike to wipe the Lupatazzi family off the map entirely. But Clariel couldn't stomach the impending slaughter. She had spent her whole life running from grinding poverty, from Jimmy's toxic shadow, from the suffocating fear of losing Leo. She was finally done running, and she refused to let Silas tear the city apart on her behalf. She knew the ensuing bloodshed would inevitably invite the FBI, threatening the fragile peace they had just found. Late that night, she found Silas in his dimly lit study. He was hunched over a massive mahogany desk, reviewing tactical blueprints of a Lupatazzi-owned shipping warehouse near Navy Pier. "Silas, you have to stop," Clariel said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. He looked up, dark circles lining his eyes. The immaculate CEO facade was completely gone, replaced by the exhausted, lethal king of the underground. "I can't stop. Clariel, Dominic crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. If I don't retaliate with overwhelming force, the other families will smell weakness. They will never stop coming for you. And if you go to war, how many of your own men die?" Clariel walked over, pressing her palms flat against the blueprints. "How long until Leo grows up in a house suffocated by paranoia and blood money? I won't let my son inherit a war zone." Silas frowned, his jaw tight. "Then what do you suggest I let the man who put a gun to your head walk free?" "No," Clariel said, her voice dropping to a steady, resolute whisper that surprised even herself. "We have Jimmy bleeding in your basement. He's a coward who will do absolutely anything to save his own skin. Dominic wants to humiliate you. He wants to take me. So, give him what he wants. Let's set a trap." Silas stood up instantly, shaking his head. "Absolutely not. I am not using you as bait. You said I was your sanctuary," Clariel countered, stepping directly into his space, forcing him to look down at her. "Let me protect you. 2. I sing at the Brass Key tomorrow night. Have Jimmy call Alexander. Tell him he managed to slip your security, and that he can deliver me to the bar while you are distracted planning your raid. Dominic is arrogant. He won't pass up the chance to gloat in person." Silas stared at her, mesmerized by the fierce, protective fire burning in her eyes. The terrified girl singing for spare change was gone. In her place stood a woman perfectly suited to stand beside him. "If anything happens to you," Silas whispered, his voice thick with a terrifying sincerity, "I will burn this city to the ground." "Then don't let anything happen to me," she replied. The following evening, the Brass Key felt like a tomb. The VIP guests had been cleared out. The only illumination came from a single, dusty spotlight hitting the center of the wooden stage. Clariel stood at the microphone, wearing the exact same faded velvet dress she had worn the night Silas first saw her. Her heart hammered against her ribs in a frantic, bruising rhythm. Leo was miles away, safe in the penthouse, at exactly midnight. The heavy iron hinges of the front doors groaned loudly. Clariel forced herself to keep singing. Her voice, a low, haunting blues melody, echoed through the empty room. She watched as 12 men in heavy trench coats filed into the bar, their weapons drawn and sweeping the corners. At the center of the pack was Dominic Lupatazzi. Beside him, limping heavily on a shattered knee and looking pale as a ghost, was Jimmy. Dominic stepped into the glow of the stage lights, clapping slowly, the sound mocking and hollow. "Beautiful," Dominic sneered. A voice like a siren. "It's a tragedy your new boyfriend has such pathetic security. Jimmy here tells me Moretti left you completely unguarded tonight. A fatal mistake." Jimmy refused to meet Clariel's eyes, trembling violently. "I brought her to you, Mr. Lupatazzi, just like we agreed. Grab her!" Dominic ordered 2 of his enforcers. "Put her in the trunk of the Lincoln." The men stepped onto the stage. Clariel didn't flinch. She simply stopped singing, letting the silence crash down over the bar. She looked directly into Dominic's scarred face. "You're right about one thing, Dominic," Clariel said, her voice ringing out clear and completely devoid of fear. "Silas does have terrible taste in security. He let you walk right into his trap." Dominic's smug smile vanished. Click. The simultaneous sound of 50 high-powered rifles chambering rounds was deafening. Dozens of red laser sights instantly pierced the darkness of the balcony, the staircases, and the shadows behind the bar, all painting Dominic and his men in lethal crimson dots. The ambient lights snapped on, blindingly bright. From the shadows of the VIP booth, Silas stepped forward. He wasn't alone. 50 of his most heavily armed enforcers stood shoulder to shoulder, completely barricading the exits. Dominic froze, the realization dawning on him too late. He spun around, grabbing Jimmy by the collar. "You set me up, you rat! No, I swear!" Jimmy shrieked, dropping to his knees. "Moretti made me do it." Silas walked slowly down the stairs, his dark eyes locked entirely on his rival. "You came into my city. Alexander, you brought violence to my family. There is no negotiation. Drop your weapons, or you all die on this floor." Knowing they were outgunned and outmaneuvered, Dominic's men slowly lowered their weapons. In less than a minute, they were disarmed and forced to their knees. Jimmy was sobbing, curled into a pathetic ball. Silas walked past the defeated men, stepping onto the small wooden stage to gently cup Clariel's face. "It's over," Silas murmured, pulling her flush against his chest. Clariel looked over Silas's shoulder at Jimmy. He looked so small, so entirely irrelevant. "What happens to him?" Clariel asked. "Whatever you want," Silas replied. Silas smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression. "As you wish." 8 months later, the brass key was scrubbed completely clean of its mob ties. It was now legally in Clariel's name, standing proudly as the premier jazz club in Chicago. On a busy Friday night, the crowd roared as Clariel finished her set in a stunning emerald gown. She stepped off the stage and walked toward the center booth. There, Silas Moretti, who had officially shifted his empire into legitimate logistics, sat in a tailored tuxedo, engaged in a serious game of peekaboo with a healthy, laughing Leo. Clariel slid into the booth, leaning against her husband's shoulder as he kissed her temple. The city outside was cold and unforgiving, but wrapped in Silas's arms. Clariel had finally found her permanent sanctuary. Wow, what an intense and emotional roller coaster from singing for tips to ruling the Chicago underworld by his side. Clariel and Silas's story proves that sometimes the darkest storms bring the most beautiful rainbows. If you loved this dramatic mafia romance, smash that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a good plot twist, and subscribe for more heart-pounding real-life tales.